She returned my lost wallet on a Tuesday morning, and there was a note folded inside it, tucked between my driver's license and a coffee shop loyalty card I'd never once remembered to use. And the note said, in handwriting I didn't recognize, "I've been watching you for months, and you never notice me. I want to be honest about what happened in the next 10 seconds because it matters." I read it twice. Then I looked up from the wallet and stared at my own front door for a long moment, because whoever had written it had apparently been standing on my porch sometime in the last hour and had chosen to leave rather than knock. And the specific combination of that fact with those words created a sensation I cannot accurately describe, except to say it was somewhere between unnerved and something considerably warmer that I didn't immediately have permission to call what it actually was. I had no idea, standing in my doorway on a Tuesday morning with a recovered wallet and an unsigned note, that the person who'd written those words had been standing 12 feet from me at a coffee counter every single weekday for 7 months, and that I had, in fact, never once noticed her. Let me take you back to the week before the wallet disappeared, because the note doesn't make sense without understanding what kind of oblivious person I had apparently become. My name is Owen. I'm 30 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a small firm that does mostly residential projects, and I live alone in a narrow 2-story house on a street full of similar narrow 2-story houses in a neighborhood that has been in the slow, gentle process of improving for the last decade and will probably finish improving sometime after I'm dead. I had been single for 2 years at that point, following a relationship that ended not with any dramatic rupture but with a slow, mutual acknowledgement that two people can genuinely like each other and still be fundamentally wrong for each other's actual lives. And I had processed that ending about as well as most people process things that aren't catastrophic but aren't nothing, which is to say, imperfectly, and mostly by redirecting my energy into work and routine and the specific productive busyness that lets you avoid noticing the quieter parts of your life. My routine was, by any honest assessment, exceptionally predictable. I woke at 6:40 every morning. I left the house at 7:20. I walked 4 blocks to the same coffee shop, a place called Groundwork, which had good espresso and enough ambient noise to feel like company without requiring actual social engagement, and where I ordered the same drink at the same counter before walking the remaining 6 blocks to the office. I ate lunch at my desk most days. I came home between 6 and 6:30. I cooked something simple or didn't. I read or worked until 11. I slept. I repeated this sequence 5 days a week with the kind of reliable precision that should have been, in retrospect, a flag that I had stopped making room in my daily life for the kind of unexpected moments that actually move things forward, and had instead optimized myself into a very efficient, very lonely machine. My coworkers would have described me, I think, as pleasant and reliable, 2 adjectives that are accurate and faint praise in roughly equal measure. I had a small number of close friends, most of whom had moved to other cities or into the specific gravity wells of their own marriages and children, and a larger number of people I got along well with and rarely saw outside of organized contexts. I went to the gym 3 times a week with the consistency of someone who had decided to make a healthy decision and then systematized it until the decision no longer required willpower to repeat. I read a great deal, mostly nonfiction, mostly things that made me feel informed about the world, which is a different and lesser thing than feeling connected to it. I was, by all external measures, a person who had organized his life competently, and the thing that was missing from this organization was not obvious until a woman with a spiral-bound notebook and a fine-point pen made it obvious in 11 words on my front porch. I lost my wallet on a Wednesday, which I only know with certainty because Wednesdays were when I typically paid for my coffee with cash, rather than my phone, a habit I'd picked up from some article about the psychology of spending that I no longer remembered the content of, but had apparently internalized enough to maintain for 2 years. I had the wallet at 7:20 when I left the house. I reached for it at 7:27 at the coffee counter and it wasn't there. I checked my jacket 3 times, my bag twice, my jacket again, and then stood at the counter with the specific helpless embarrassment of a person who has inexplicably lost the object they touch more frequently than almost any other object in their daily life. The person behind the counter, a young man I'd been handing cash to twice a week for at least a year and whose name I did not know, offered to spot me the coffee, and I thanked him and made a mental note to pay double the following week and spent the rest of the walk to the office retracing my morning, which produced no useful information. I filed the practical, immediate responses to a lost wallet, checked my pockets at home that evening, confirmed it wasn't in my bag or on my desk, reported my cards and ordered replacements, and resigned myself to the annoyance of rebuilding the wallet's contents, which is the specific bureaucratic indignity of losing identification that makes an already irritating situation feel considerably worse. I mentioned it to no one because losing a wallet is not the kind of thing that invites commiseration, and went to bed mildly irritated and mostly over it. The following Tuesday morning, I opened my front door to leave for work and found the wallet sitting on my porch, placed precisely in the center of the doormat as if someone had taken care with the positioning, with a rubber band around it that hadn't been there before. I picked it up. The rubber band held a folded piece of paper against the wallet's face. I stood on my own porch in the early morning light and read what was on the paper, and I have already told you what it said. So I won't repeat it, but I will tell you what I did next, which is stand there for a full minute and a half doing nothing except thinking, before walking back inside and sitting down at my kitchen table with the wallet and the note in front of me, and spending another 10 minutes simply looking at them. The handwriting was neat, small, slightly right-leaning. The paper was a page torn from a small notebook, the kind with a wire spiral at the top, the torn edge clean. She had written in black ink, with what I recognized as a fine-point pen from the pressure consistency of the lines. These are the details I noticed because I am a person trained to observe structural details, and in the absence of any other information, I applied that training to the only evidence I had, what I couldn't deduce from the handwriting. Who she was, where she'd found the wallet, how she knew which house was mine, or what "watching you for months" actually meant in practical terms. What I could deduce, she had gone to some effort. Finding the wallet was one thing. Finding my address was another. Leaving the note rather than simply returning the wallet with a polite knock was a third, and the most significant, because it suggested that whatever she'd wanted to communicate mattered enough to say, but not enough to say directly. I went to groundwork the following morning and paid double what I owed the young man at the counter, as I'd promised myself. And I also, for the first time in at least several months, actually looked around the room while I waited for my order. I don't mean glanced. I mean looked. The way you look at a space when you're trying to understand its geography rather than simply moving through it. There were 8 tables, 4 along the left wall, 4 in the center. The counter ran along the right side with 4 stools I had never seen anyone actually use. The baristas worked in a rotation I now observed as 3 people. The young man, a woman with braided hair who I thought was named Keisha based on overhearing a greeting, and a third person whose schedule I apparently hadn't registered as regular enough to form a mental image of. I ordered my drink. I waited. I looked at the room and its people, none of whom returned my gaze with any particular recognition, and I left having accomplished nothing except a slight increase in my general awareness that the world continued to exist around me regardless of whether I was paying attention to it. It was 3 days later that I realized what I'd been looking for without quite knowing it. I was standing at the counter on a Friday morning, slightly later than usual because I'd overslept by 20 minutes, and the room was more crowded than I typically encountered, a Thursday morning density on a Friday, and I was standing at the counter waiting for my order when I became aware, with the specific delayed clarity of someone finally registering something that had been present all along, that the woman standing 2 spots to my left had been standing in that position, in some version of that position, every single weekday morning for as long as I could remember noticing the mornings, which was to say she had been there every morning and I had never once actually seen her. I noticed her the way you notice something that you've been not noticing so consistently, it has become invisible through sheer repetition, and the noticing arrived with the particular disorienting force of suddenly perceiving a piece of furniture you've walked past 100 times and never consciously registered. She was maybe my age, maybe a couple of years younger, With dark hair she usually wore up in a way that suggested she did it in a hurry. And she was reading something on her phone with the focused expression of someone who is genuinely interested in what they're reading rather than simply passing time. She had a bag from what I recognized as the architecture firm 3 blocks down, which meant she worked there or was at minimum retrieving something for someone who did. She ordered a flat white, 2 sugars, with the ease of someone repeating a phrase they had said so many times it no longer required conscious assembly. She did not look at me. I stood there with my own drink cooling slightly in my hand and felt something that was difficult to name. A kind of retroactive embarrassment at my own perceptual failure combined with something more present and immediate that had nothing to do with embarrassment at all. The room I had been moving through for 7 months had contained this specific, observable person every single morning, and I had not once allowed her to become something I would recognize outside of it. I thought about the note. I've been watching you for months, and you never notice me. The accuracy of those 11 words settled into me with the particular weight of something true, rather than something merely said. And I finished my coffee standing at the counter, which I never did, and paid attention to the room in a way I never had, and left feeling slightly more present in my own life than I had when I'd walked in. I did not speak to her that morning, because I am not someone who speaks to strangers in coffee shops without something resembling a reason, and I didn't have one. But I came back the following Monday with the deliberate intention of being the kind of person who looks at the room. And I confirmed within about 40 seconds of arriving that she was there, 2 spots to my left, flat white 2 sugars, reading her phone. Bag from the architecture firm and still not looking at me. I did this for 3 more days before I did something about it, which was to say, too long. But I was working up to it in the particular way of someone who has decided to do something that requires more nerve than their daily life has recently asked of them. On Thursday, I arrived slightly earlier than usual, which put me at the counter before she'd ordered, and I managed, with approximately the grace of someone who had not attempted casual conversation with a stranger in 2 years, to say something to her about the coffee she was about to order. Something specific and moderately informed about the flat white, a comparison to another preparation, an opening that at least had the virtue of being grounded in observable fact rather than a general remark about the weather. She looked up from her phone. She looked at me directly for the first time since I'd started looking, and her expression was the specific expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular thing to happen and is now watching it happen and is trying not to let that be visible in her face. Which is to say, her expression was almost perfectly neutral except for something around her eyes that was not entirely neutral at all. "You found it," she said. Not a question. I had in fact found it. The note. The wallet. Her. Though I hadn't said anything yet that would confirm I'd made the connection, which meant she had either decided to give herself away or had decided that the time for maintaining the fiction of anonymity had run its course. "I have some questions," I said. "I know," she said, and picked up her flat white when it arrived, and walked to one of the 4 tables along the left wall and sat down and looked at me with an expression that said, without ambiguity, that the questions were welcome. Her name was Nadia. She worked at the architecture firm 3 blocks down, as I'd correctly inferred from the bag, specifically as a junior associate doing mostly commercial interior work, which she described with the specific blend of engagement and mild resignation of someone who had found a livable compromise between what they wanted to do and what their practical life currently required. She had been coming to groundwork every weekday morning for just under 8 months, which was slightly longer than I had been coming, though we'd overlapped for 7, which was the period she'd apparently been referring to in the note. She had found my wallet on the sidewalk between the coffee shop and my office. The Tuesday I'd lost it. I'd apparently dropped it somewhere in the first 2 blocks. And she had looked inside for identification, found my driver's license with my address, and made a decision about what to do next that she freely admitted was not entirely conventional. "Why not just knock?" I asked. "I walked to your house twice," she said, and stood on the sidewalk in front of it twice. And both times I decided that returning a lost wallet while also disclosing that I'd been observing you every morning. For 7 months without your knowledge, was a combination that required some thought about sequencing. The note didn't solve the sequencing problem, I said. No, she agreed. It didn't. But it felt more honest than returning the wallet as if I were a stranger. Because I wasn't a stranger even if you didn't know that. I spent a moment with that. There was something in the specific logic of it that I found, against the odds, compelling, not the action itself, which was objectively a little strange, but the reasoning behind it, which was the reasoning of someone who had a higher-than-average tolerance for her own feelings and a lower-than-average tolerance for dishonesty, and those are not the worst combination of traits a person can have. "What were you watching?" I asked. I said it carefully, because the word had a range of possible meanings and I wanted to know which one she meant. She looked at me for a moment before answering. "Watching is probably too strong," she said. "I was present in the same space you were present in every morning for 7 months. And I noticed you and you never noticed me. And after a certain number of mornings, that becomes something you've either decided to do or decided not to do, and I hadn't decided to tell you either way, until the wallet made the decision for me." "What did you notice?" I asked, and I asked it without entirely meaning to, and she heard that in how I said it, because her expression shifted very slightly in a way that suggested she understood I was asking something I wouldn't normally ask a stranger. "That you order the same drink every time," she said. "That you look at your phone while you wait, not your surroundings. That you always hold the door for whoever's behind you, even when they're far enough back that it creates an awkward half-jog situation for them. That you tip more than you probably realize you're tipping because you always hand over cash without counting it carefully. That you seem to be thinking about something other than where you are almost every morning. And whatever you're thinking about doesn't make you unhappy but also doesn't make you particularly happy. And I found that interesting. If you have ever had someone describe a 7-month pattern of observation about your own life and found it more illuminating than alarming, you will understand what the next few minutes felt like. I sat across from a woman I had never once consciously noticed, who had apparently been paying more attention to the texture of my daily existence than I had, and I felt something that was a complicated mixture of embarrassment at my own obliviousness and something considerably less complicated that I didn't put a name to yet. We talked for 40 minutes. I was late to the office for the first time in several months. She was late to the firm, which she mentioned with the offhand ease of someone who was not particularly worried about it. We covered in the way of two people who have discovered an unexpected opening and are moving through it with some urgency. Where we'd grown up, what we'd studied, what we'd wanted to study and hadn't, what we actually thought about our jobs versus what we said about them at parties. The specific things that made the neighborhood we'd independently ended up in worth living in despite its ongoing and interminable process of improvement. She asked me what I thought about when I wasn't thinking about where I was in the morning. And I told her, more honestly than I'd intended, that I was usually thinking about load-bearing calculations or the particular way a client had described something that didn't match what they actually seemed to want. And she said that was almost exactly the same as her morning thought content, which felt like the beginning of something rather than a coincidence. There was a moment, maybe 20 minutes into the conversation, when she said something about a building she'd been working on, a specific problem with a client's brief that didn't match the site's actual spatial reality and the way she described it was so precise and so observant that I stopped paying attention to what I was going to say next and started paying attention to how she was saying it. The specific vocabulary she'd built for talking about space and proportion. And I had the particular clear thought that this was a person who had looked at the world carefully enough to develop a genuine language for describing it, which is rarer than it should be and considerably more interesting than most conversations I'd had in the last 2 years. I asked for her number before I left, and she gave it to me, and I texted her that afternoon with no particular reason except that I had her number and wanted to use it, and she responded within minutes, and the conversation we started that afternoon continued, with interruptions for sleep and work and the various necessities of actual life, for the better part of the following week. She was a good text correspondent, not in the way that means frequent, but in the way that means specific. Each message actually about something rather than a holding pattern maintaining connection between moments of actual contact. She told me things she'd noticed that day. small, sharp observations about the city and its people, and I found myself doing the same, narrating moments from my own day with more attention than I'd typically applied to them, as if having an audience who paid attention, required me to pay attention to. We had dinner the following Saturday at a small Vietnamese place she'd been going to for years that I'd walked past probably 200 times without going in, and we split 3 dishes and talked until the restaurant had largely emptied around us and the staff were doing the specific pointed cleaning that indicates a place is closing. And I walked her home afterward because she lived 6 blocks from the restaurant in a direction that was not entirely out of my way if I was willing to add 14 minutes to the walk, which I was. We stood on her block for another 20 minutes talking about nothing and everything. The specific delaying behavior of 2 people who have found a good thing and are reluctant to end it, even when ending it is the practical and sensible choice. And when she finally said she should go in, she looked at me for a moment with the same expression she'd had at the coffee counter the first morning, the one that was almost perfectly neutral except for the eyes. "For what it's worth," she said, "I noticed you because you looked like someone who was thinking about something worth thinking about. That's rarer than it should be at 7:20 in the morning." "For what it's worth," I said, "I notice you now." She smiled. The specific, slow, particular smile of someone who has been waiting for a thing to be said and is deciding not to perform how much it means to them, and went inside. And I walked the 14 extra minutes home through my neighborhood in the October dark, feeling more awake than I had felt in at least a year. We kept going to groundwork, both of us, every weekday morning, but no longer 2 spots apart at the counter without speaking. We started arriving at roughly the same time. Or one of us would arrive first and save the 2 spots, and we'd stand at the counter together and order our drinks and then either stay for 20 minutes if we'd arrived early enough or take everything to go if we hadn't. And either way, there was the specific daily pleasure of something to look forward to at 7:20 in the morning that wasn't just espresso. I learned, over the weeks that followed, all the things you learn about a person when you've decided to pay close attention to them. The way she thought through problems out loud before committing to conclusions, the specific books she returned to rather than moving on from, the particular warmth she brought to anyone who was struggling even mildly that made people in her immediate vicinity feel consistently more capable than they had moments before. I learned the architecture of her opinions and the way she held them, firmly but without brittleness, willing to change them in the face of actual evidence, which was not as common a quality as people like to claim about themselves. There was a Wednesday, about a month in, when we were walking back from dinner. We'd started doing this a few times a week. Some permutation of dinner or coffee or walking that didn't require a label but had accumulated enough regularity that it was clearly something. And she stopped on a block I'd walked down 1,000 times and pointed up at a building I'd never actually looked at. A converted warehouse that I'd registered only as a large building that was sometimes between me and where I was going. "Look at the cornice line," she said, "and then look at the window spacing below it. Someone made a mistake in the proportioning and then tried to fix it by adding that ledge, and it doesn't quite work. But you can see what they were trying to do." I stood on the sidewalk and looked at a building I'd walked past 1,000 times and saw it, for the first time as a series of decisions someone had made, some right and some wrong, all of them visible if you knew how to look. That is the specific quality I am trying to describe when I say that being with her changed how I moved through the world, not because she demanded attention, but because attention was so naturally part of how she existed that it became easier to access in her vicinity. I learned that she had been watching me for 7 months, not because she had made any particular decision to, but because I had walked into her peripheral vision one morning and stayed there. And she was the kind of person who paid attention to things that stayed in her peripheral vision rather than dismissing them as background noise. 4 months after the wallet, on a Saturday afternoon in February, we were walking through the neighborhood in the specific aimless way of 2 people spending a day together without any particular agenda. And she said, without particular preamble, "I want to tell you something about the note." "Okay," I said. "I almost didn't put it in," she said. "I had the wallet and your address, and I was standing on your porch and I had the note in my pocket, and I stood there for probably 3 minutes deciding whether to leave it. It's a strange thing to say to someone, that you've been watching them. It sounds like considerably more than it was, or considerably less depending on how you read it. "How did you mean it?" I asked. "I meant it accurately," she said. "You were there every morning, and I was there every morning, and at some point I stopped being a stranger in your peripheral vision and became someone you meant something to, even if you didn't know it. Not something romantic, necessarily, at that point. Just something. A face that had its own texture, its own specific presence. I didn't want to hand the wallet back and pretend that hadn't happened." "Why not?" I said. She thought about it for a moment, the way she thought about things that deserved actual thought rather than quick answers. "Because it felt like a lie of omission," she said. "And because the wallet appearing on your porch gave me a reason that the morning counter never had. I've wanted to say something for months. The wallet made it possible to say it without it coming from nowhere. I thought about the specific courage that required, not the grand, visible kind of courage that gets acknowledged and admired, but the quieter, more ordinary kind of standing on a stranger's porch in the late morning and deciding that saying a true thing mattered more than the risk of it landing wrong. There is a particular kind of person who operates that way, who has decided at some point that the discomfort of being honest is preferable to the longer, slower discomfort of not being, and they are rare enough that when you find one, the finding feels significant in a way that exceeds the specific situation. "I'm glad you left it," I said. She looked at me sideways in the February light, the slow, particular smile again. "I know," she said. "You told me that when you walked into the coffee shop the next morning looking at the room like you'd never seen it before, which I found deeply charming and slightly mortifying on your behalf." "You noticed that?" "I notice most things," she said. "I know that now," I said. We walked the rest of the afternoon in the neighborhood. Through streets I'd walked 1,000 times without registering most of what was on them, and she named things as we passed them. A small painted mural on a side street I'd never turned down. A building she'd heard had interesting structural bones, the specific way the light hit a particular stretch of sidewalk on winter afternoons that she'd been meaning to photograph for months. She didn't make me feel foolish for not having seen these things before. She just let me see them now, through a perspective that had been paying attention to the world in a way mine hadn't been, and the afternoon had the quality of something that was opening rather than closing, expanding rather than settling, I thought as we walked. About the 7 months of mornings I had spent in the same small room as her, ordering the same drink at the same counter, moving through the same sequence with the same reliable efficiency, and how thoroughly I had managed to make myself invisible to my own experience of the world. I had been, in some functional sense, present in that coffee shop every morning for 7 months. And I had also, in some equally functional sense, not been there at all, not in the way that allows you to actually encounter what's in the room with you. Nadia had been in the room. I had been somewhere else, thinking about structural loads and client briefs and the particular efficiency of my route to the office. The wallet, the note's 11 words. All of it was the world trying to tell me, through the gentlest possible intervention, that I had stopped showing up to my own life. 2 months after that walk, we said what we meant directly, rather than sideways. Which is to say, I told her I loved her in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday evening when neither of us had planned for it to happen that way. And she said she knew, and then she said she loved me too. And neither of us performed surprise at any part of that exchange. Because it had been true for long enough that saying it out loud was simply the acknowledgement of something that had already organized itself into fact. I want to tell you about the Tuesday it happened, because the circumstance matters. We were at my kitchen table, which had previously been a place where I ate alone in the specific efficient silence of a person who has optimized even their meals for productivity, and which had become, over the previous months, a place where dinner was a 2-hour event that occasionally involved wine and always involved her reading something interesting, out loud because she had a habit of sharing things she found, genuinely worth sharing rather than waiting to be asked. She was reading something about a building in Tokyo that had apparently solved an interesting structural problem in a way that neither of us had seen before, and she was describing it with that particular attention she brought to things that excited her. And I was watching her talk and thinking something I had not fully articulated to myself yet. And then she looked up from whatever she'd been reading and said, "What?" Because I'd apparently been quiet for long enough to register as unusual, and I said it simply, without preamble. I told her I loved her. She looked at me for a moment that was specific and quiet and entirely her own. "I know," she said. And then, "I love you too." And we sat at my kitchen table in the specific, unremarkable warmth of an ordinary Tuesday evening, and neither of us said anything else for a moment, because nothing else needed to be said right then. And I thought about a note folded inside a wallet on a porch. 11 words written by a person I hadn't known existed, and the specific chain of small events, a dropped wallet, a found note, a return, a choice, that had led to this exact moment in a kitchen that now smelled like whatever she'd brought for dinner and sounded like the city outside and felt, for the first time in 2 years, fully inhabited in a way that efficient solitude had never quite managed. I have a note in my jacket pocket that I carry with me every day. Not the original. I gave that back to her as a small gesture of reciprocal honesty. The way you return something borrowed when you've decided the exchange goes both ways, but a copy I made in my own handwriting. 11 words in a space I keep checking to make sure it's still there. She laughed when I gave her the original back, the specific short laugh of someone who hadn't expected something and found it better than what they'd have expected. She keeps it in her desk at the architecture firm, she told me, in the small drawer that locks, which she had previously used for nothing except a spare key and a lip balm. The wallet note is in there now with those 2 things, which tells me something about how it sits in the arrangement of things she considers worth protecting. Some things you want to know you haven't lost. I walk past groundwork every morning, 2 spots from where she stands when she's there. And now I see her every morning, and that seems to me, though I am not given to this kind of language, like the precise and specific point of the whole thing. Not the romance of a stranger's note. Not the appealing strangeness of being watched without knowing it, but the much simpler and much larger fact that I was in the same room as someone worth noticing, and I wasn't noticing anything. And then the world created a very small, very particular opportunity to pay attention, and I finally did. That is what I'm grateful for. Not the accident of the dropped wallet, not the generosity of the woman who returned it, but my own eventual willingness to look up from my phone at a 720 counter and register that the world had been there the whole time, waiting to be seen. She is already at the counter when I arrive on the mornings she gets there first, and she saves the spot next to her without being asked because that is the kind of thing she does. She pays attention to what the people around her need before they've finished forming the thought. And the barista, whose name I now know is Marcus, has started making our drinks when he sees us both walk in, which is the specific small recognition that 2 people have become a predictable unit in the geography of a room. And I find every morning that I am glad to be predictable in exactly that way. I notice every day now. I notice the specific angle of the light at 7:20 in October. I notice the way certain buildings handle the transition from facade to cornice. I notice the specific sound the city makes on a Tuesday morning as opposed to a Thursday. I notice all of this because she taught me to, by standing in the same room as me for 7 months paying attention to things I was walking past, and by being brave enough, when the opportunity arrived, to say so. I don't know what the actual architecture of a life is supposed to look like, in any formal sense. But I know that the one I have now looks considerably less like a building that someone made a mistake in the proportioning of, and considerably more like something where all the decisions, right and wrong, have finally added up to something that actually works.